Hello and welcome to the Drug Free Workplace Training Session. My name is Britney Bryson. I am one of the counselors at Concern EAP, and I will be walking you through our information for today. Now, just to get us started, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, just right off the top, feel free to reach out to us at 901-458-4000 or 1-800-445-5011. We do have crisis response available for both numbers too. Of course, we'll re-advertise and tell you about our contact information later as well. But if you just have questions right at the tip of your tongue, please feel free to reach out to us. But for today, we are going to focus on several things. This is going to be a bit longer of one of our talks. Sometimes they're traditionally 15 minutes, but today we'll strap in for a little bit longer, perhaps 30 minutes or so. So make sure you get your snacks and your coffee and settle in as we learn about drug-free workplace policies, the impact of substance use on the workplace, understanding use, abuse, and addiction, looking at specific drugs that are being abused, signs and symptoms of substance abuse, how family and coworkers are impacted, and of course, resources that are available to help. So let's first look at that drug-free workplace policy. Why is there even a drug-free workplace policy needed? Well, a lot of times employers do suffer quite a bit from substance use, and things like absenteeism, accidents, medical claims, theft, and even a decrease in productivity often occur when there are folks who are dealing with substances and that substance use or abuse or addiction has gone untreated in any kind of way. And sometimes it poses a risk, not just to that person, but to the company, to the clients of that company, and perhaps even to the public if we're serving the public as well. So there are a lot of safety and risk factors when it comes to substance use, abuse, or addiction in the workplace. And most companies are going to be very committed to providing a safe work environment. It is their responsibility to make sure their employees have the space and opportunity to do their job and do what they need to do safely and within healthy means and restrictions. And this means fostering well-being and healthy practices for the employees of the company. The commitment to this safety is jeopardized if and when someone abuses or uses illegal substances on or off the job. So it's not just saying that if someone uses on site or at work, even if it happens at home, some of those side effects and repercussions can follow us to work. And coming to work under the influence, possessing or distributing any kind of substances absolutely violates and jeopardizes the company's ability to keep everyone safe. So it's a violation of the company policy, of course, to possess, use, sell, trade, offer, to buy or sell any illegal substances or otherwise engage in it on and even or off the job. So as a violation of that company policy, it's also employers' responsibility to report yeah, if there is something happening under the influence or while a substance is in a person's body, urine, or blood flow, if any illegal thing can be detectable through a drug screen, of course. So if that happens, of course, it's required to be reported, and there are certain processes that can follow that report. And again, this is where mentioning to these general policies are across the board. So common things that could be in a drug-free work policy. I encourage you to check out your own drug-free work policy at your own company. Everyone can be possibly a little bit different from who to contact to what to do next. So just make sure you're really familiar with your own personal policies at your work. These are just general ideas of what could be included. Also, maybe some are not included. Either way, it's very important to know what your individual company requires of you. So keeping that in mind too. But this gives us a general overview of what could be there. So back to this. So if a violation of company policy for any employee to use prescription drugs illegally, to use prescription drugs that have not been legally obtained or in a matter of a purpose or other than prescribed. However, nothing in this policy precludes the appropriate use of legally prescribed medication. So in other words, you could have a prescription for a substance that perhaps is even a controlled substance. meaning it has a possibility of being addictive. Um, and if any point you're caught using a substance that was not prescribed to you, that would be an illegal obtaining of that substance. Even it is technically a quote unquote prescription, that prescription wasn't written to you. So that's still illegal use of the substance. And honestly, even if you were prescribed a certain substance, taking too much of that substance or overtaking a substance can be an illegal use as well, because that's not perhaps what the prescription was used for. But either way, it's a violation of company policy for any employee to report under the influence or impaired by alcohol or any other substances, so prescribed or otherwise. Violations of these policies to this point would be subject to disciplinary action. And that could include termination, but there are a lot of other things that are in place, hopefully to not get to that point. But the company's managers and supervisors do take responsibility if they see changes in performance in their employees that may suggest an issue with substances. And don't get me, your supervisor or your manager, they're not there to diagnose, of course, anyone or anything with any sort of problem, but they are there to counsel and guide and question and monitor and evaluate employees' productivity and ability to do the job that everyone is there to do. And if they're noticing there are changes in that, the employee is able to, or employer or the manager, supervisor is able to recommend or suggest that the employee seek help and advise about available resources. Everyone shares a responsibility to maintain safety at work, right? So it's not just the employer, it's everyone. And your coworkers should be able to also see something if something is going amiss or changing for you, and offer some resources as well if they know that a problem is occurring or if they know seeking help could make an improvement. So everyone has the ability to reach out and provide resources if they see things are changing. And the goal of this policy is to balance two things, really. We want to balance the respect for the individual who needs perhaps the services, uh, and we want to balance having a safe environment. And this can be a delicate balance. What we also understand is when we talk about substances and when we talk about substance abuse, there are a lot of different, perhaps, schools of thought that come into play, whether it is your belief that people who use substances, it is their choice, or this is a behavioral thing they need to just change, or perhaps you have a medical model thinking of this is a brain disease, which makes someone make chronic differences between their thought patterns and decision making, which according to the CDC, it is. Addiction is a chronic brain disease that alters the way in which one thinks, feels, and behaves. So we want to respect the medical aspect and the severity of the mental health concern that comes with substance use, abuse, and addiction. And we also want to make sure we maintain the need to provide safety for everyone involved. So the intent of the policy is to offer help, not to be punitive and not to imply or pressure or apply shame to any kind of way. We want to send a clear message that the illegal use of substances is not okay, and the abuse of alcohol is just not compatible with the safety and maintaining a healthy work environment. So we want to make sure we know that it's not acceptable. At the same time, we want to still accept people for who they are and understand we all have struggles, and let's be very clear on how we can help each other through those struggles. So most companies require employees to notify the company of any conviction or violation of a criminal drug statute no later than 5 days after conviction. So if there was something that happened offsite that your company probably would never have known about, you still have to inform the company about that conviction if it does happen. The company can offer EAP assistance benefits for employees and their dependents. So for the employee himself and the people that are living with them in their home. An EAP can provide confidential assessment, referral if needed, and counseling for employees and anyone in their home who needs it. Confidentiality is assured for those. Now, when we say referral, we're looking at different levels of care, possibly, just depending on what level of use we're at, the situations perhaps we're concerned about, how long we've been using. It sort of varies. And towards the end, we'll talk about the different levels of care that are available just briefly. Perhaps if we stick with the EAP referral, of course, there'll be individual sessions. We have some substance abuse groups that could be an option too. Another level to consider is IOP, which is intensive outpatient services, residential, perhaps if another level, if we need detox assistance or help to get the substance out of our body safely to return to a baseline. In either situation, when we say, in addition, confidentiality is assured, that means that anything you say, do, talk about, stays between you and your counselor. So even if this does become a situation where it is a formal management referral, so an FMR from a supervisor or manager, your attendance is the main thing that is reported or discussed. So your compliance with treatment is what's discussed, not necessarily the details of what you're talking about or your concerns or the issues that are at hand. So mainly your compliance, and of course, drug screens that follow that. So you do still have your confidentiality with just the acceptance of attendance if it's an FMR. Now, if it's not an FMR, you're coming voluntarily, there is no communication with the employer. So just keeping those things in mind too when it comes to the resources that could be offered and what can be available through EAP. So if you do access EAP, again, voluntary, involuntarily, it won't impact an employee's advancement or employment. Now, if you are FMR, it could impact if the FMR referral is based on your continuing with the company. Like if you are in non-compliance, and they made it very clear that if you're not in compliance, then other decisions will be made, then in that case, that would be different. But if you're seeking EAP benefits voluntarily, your career advancement or employment it's not impacted, and no disciplinary action will come of it. So if you are FMR and you follow through with compliance and you're doing the things that's asked of you, traditionally you will continue on, complete the sessions, and go forward with your employment and career history. So any employee reporting to work visibly impaired will traditionally be deemed unable to perform required duties and will not be allowed to work during that day at that time. So if possible, sometimes the employees and managers will seek another manager's opinion. So they'll try to get some consultation around it usually, and they'll consult with the employee yourself individually about what could be going on, of course, what they're observing, and express any concerns about substance use. If things are found that or things are warranted, that you could go forward with a substance test or get a drug screen, then that could be the company's next step. They do have a right to request random drug screens a lot of times in companies of employees. And you can either, based on that drug screen result, contest it to the medical review within 5 working days after receiving a written notification of the result. Now, a lot of times contesting it can look like, well, I was prescribed. We talked about prescribed medications before. I was prescribed this medication for pain, what have you, and I took it that morning, and perhaps that can be part of your explanation. Or if you have another explanation about what substances can be in your system, you're free to discuss that. And then it'll be up to course managers and supervisors to discuss what happens next, but you'll have the opportunity to advocate for yourself. A couple of reasons why that drug screen would be even coming up in the first place, of course, is reasonable suspicion. So maybe something happened and they believed an employee is under the influence of some kind, or an on-the-job injury. And don't get me wrong, I am a child of the I Love Lucy and Ricky Ricardo ages as well. I know accidents happen. Sometimes we as humans are just accident prone and a little bit clumsy. But other times when on-the-job injuries, especially serious on-the-job injuries occur, there's damage to property or a personal injury of some kind, they still are able, employers and supervisors and managers are still able to request those drug screens to make sure everyone is still safe and able to continue their job, even if it was just an accident that spurred the concern. So keeping that in mind too. So other testing circumstances, there's follow-up treatment. So companies may require an attendance to a follow-up program for drug abuse. So if that test was positive, they recommend a drug screen program or a drug program that could be part of what we do at EAP if recommended. There could also be a routine fitness for duty testing. This is not something that will be done with EAP. This will be a different provider with your employer. And this company will contact the employee to submit a drug or alcohol test, and it's conducted as part of a routine scheduled employee fitness for duty medical examination. So done by a doctor, where a doctor will see if you are fit for duty or fit to return to work. So that could be a separate part of your drug treatment process or testing circumstances, in addition to follow-up treatment if needed. There's also additional random drug screening. So the company still reserves the right to conduct random drug screening at their discretion. So it can be however often they deem fit, even after a violation has occurred. So another bit when it comes to is also alcohol testing. So the consumption or possession of alcohol beverages in the company premises is, again, traditionally prohibited, with the caveat that maybe you have a holiday function or a party of some kind and they choose to serve alcohol there, then that may be an exception. But the general rule, during the day when we're working, substances not allowed. So, and employees whose normal faculties are impaired due to alcoholic beverages while on the duty shall be guilty of also misconduct. So we're not just talking about illegal substances here. It can be alcohol as well. And actually alcohol is the most abused substance we have. And to think about it, it's so accessible, so easy to get a hold of. If you're a part of Shelby County or the Memphis area, maybe you've heard once or more times that, here around these parts, we have a church and a liquor store in every corner. So the accessibility is definitely there. And sometimes our even not really understanding of how these substances really impact our body and can severely impact our body going forward. So a lot of times we are still struggling with the consumption and abuse of alcohol. So when an employee or job applicant submits a drug screen or alcohol test, they will be given a copy of that chain of custody form for your records, so you'll have one too. And if a positive test is confirmed, medical review officers will attempt to contact the person, so the person who was positive, in order to privately discuss what happened, the findings of this results. Any information provided about medications taken by the employee will be kept confidential and not given to the employer. So the things you discuss, again, with the medical review officer doesn't get back to the employee, but the judgment about it, about whether it is a drug issue or appropriate use of medication, is going to be deemed based on what that medical review officer says. So keeping that in mind too. A failure to submit that required substance test is also a judgment of misconduct or disciplinary. So keeping that in mind, it's not like we can't just skip it if we don't want to do it. We still have to do it, and there will still be disciplinary action if we just decide not to. And that could include termination depending on your employer's policies. And this is where we get into the details of the different policies. Making sure that for your policy at your place of employment, would missing a drug screen mean termination? So clearing up those facts for yourself so you will know. So substance use testing for job applicants and employees will include a urinalysis screen for traditionally these following drugs. So alcohol, amphetamines, cannabinoids, cocaine, PCP, and opiates. So a lot of times we do have, just to rewind back to cannabinoids for 2 seconds, we have this, of course, upsurge in CBD stores and CBD oils and gummies, and we think they don't have THC in them, but honestly, what we're finding is a lot of these new things, including things like Delta 8, we are finding, in fact, do have a bit of THC in them. So sometimes folks are still popping positive, even if they are believing that, oh, I'm just using CBD products, oh, I'm just using um, CBD gummies and there's no THC in them. Well, sometimes they still do. Unfortunately, these things aren't as regulated as we would love for them to be, and they're not as uh, well regulated and approved from the FDA. So we're not positive everything that's in it just yet. We're still doing a lot of research on it. So still being very mindful, very careful. Even if we think something is just CBD, there is a possibility THC may be there too. And THC is what will pop up on those drug screens. So keeping that in mind as well. So having those things in mind, just a brief moment to ask yourself, if you were to get a drug screen right now, today, would you pass? And of course, no one is asking for a drug screen in this moment right now, so no need to go into a state of shock. But it is something to make sure you ask yourself as often as you need to. Like, would I pass the drug screen today if my job told me I had to do a random screening within the next week or 24 hours? Would I be able to pass? And that will be something to consider when it comes to how you're taking care of yourself, substances we're putting in your bodies, and honestly, is it worth it? Is it worth the risk of having to walk through each part of the policy and of these steps to make sure you continue to take care of yourself and your employment? So ask yourself that question as often as you think you need. But when it comes to the impact of substance abuse in the workplace, a lot of things could be in jeopardy. For example, employee health, productivity, decision making, safety, employee morale, security, and organizational image and community relations. Because folks who are involved with substances or substance users or who abuse substances and who are in the throes of addiction can have decision-making concerns or changes that are not reflective of, honestly, perhaps what they really used to be like or want to do. Perhaps there are changes, but they're not decisions that are going to be beneficial to the company, to the people around them, and sometimes even themselves. And we just know statistically that substance abuse is a prevalent concern. Nearly 3 out of 4 current users of illegal substances are actively employed, and 60% of the world's production of illegal drugs is consumed in the United States. And alcohol, I mentioned that before, is the leading drug of abuse. 10% of the population is substance abuse dependent. And of course, these folks still have jobs, still work, and sometimes have incidents or concerns when it comes to not just work, personal lives, family lives too. And there are things that a lot of time that we look out for that is noticeable when it comes to employees who abuse substances. So sometimes these are folks who change jobs frequently. Perhaps they're late or absent to work. They're not as productive as other employees. And they perhaps even file workers' compensation claims because of accidents and things that happen. Now, taking a caveat here, again, just to go back and revisit substance use abuse and the idea of addiction or the condition of addiction. When we see the behaviors of a person who's dealing with these things, just keeping in mind that's what we see. We only see the behaviors. We don't always see what the person is going through, what they're thinking, what they're feeling, their experiences. We are only entitled and able to access the information that is available, which is their behaviors. And it is not a place for us to judge, pass assumptions. It's just a place for us to go, pause, and understand what is happening. Yes, it's impacting our environment. Perhaps, yes, their things are in jeopardy. Then we can look at how, not why this is happening, but how. How can we make sure we ensure the safety of this person and those around them? And in step, hopefully, perhaps the help and resources we'll discuss later too, because it does get pretty involved about the use and abuse and transition to how people become addicted to substances. So bear with me because this is sort of like a process, right? No one wakes up one day and just magically becomes addicted to substances. It happens one step at a time. It starts with use. So use or experimentation, sometimes perhaps as a stress reliever or a curiosity, even maybe even social or recreational purposes. Starts off slow at the very beginning. At some point, though, after that use becomes more enticing, after our brains connect use to, oh, this feels good, or oh, I feel less bad or sad than I did before because of this substance. So we then begin to marry the two ideas of this substance makes me feel good. Hmm. And once our body makes that connection with substances, sometimes it goes to another level, which it goes to abuse. So using a substance to modify or control mood. Now, so this is the change. I'm no longer using as necessarily a stress reliever. I'm now using to change how I feel. And in this case, this begins to alter my state of mind in a manner that is illegal or harmful to others because my decision making is beginning to be impacted. A lot of times, the consequences that we will experience, and you'll see some listed here, the accidents, blackouts, legal problems, poor job performance, family behaviors, or even sexual behaviors that increase the risk of harming ourselves or others, or HIV infections. Um, these things would increase, but they would not necessarily stop our use. So abuse comes in when we are now using and we no longer have the ability to stop, even if there are consequences present. So we've gone from wanting to use for fun recreationally to now not really paying much attention to the consequences that are at hand. The next step that it goes to could be addiction. So this is the irresistible consumption of use of alcohol or other substances despite the adverse consequences. And now we're also talking about being at a point where our body is now chemically dependent on a substance. So rewinding back a little bit, when we were in use, when someone is in use when it comes to substances, we've just started, your body still has an idea of what naturally feeds your hormones. So that's a lot of times what substances will go directly to your hormones and your neurotransmitters. So we have natural things like dopamine and serotonin. You've heard these, perhaps heard these words before. The happy chemical like oxycontin, things like that. Uh, Oxytocin, I mean, things like that. And as part of those natural neurotransmitters and hormones in your body, they take on and respond to naturally occurring things in your life. For example, dopamine is your reward system. It responds to eating, having goals fulfilled for yourself, working out, and sex for adults. And it responds to those things excitably, like, oh, when I get these things, I feel good. Now, when we take in substances, all of those hormones, all of those neurotransmitters get off whack because the substances will outweigh and override, right, all those naturally occurring balances every single time. And when you get a rush of those substances that are synthetic, they're not real, they're not natural, your body will be overwhelmed by them. It's like, oh my goodness, this, I've never felt this before. This is what I want to feel. And I never understood why I haven't been able to feel this at another time. And when it gets that relationship and connection, again, they marry the two thoughts of this feels good, this substance feels good. It goes down a spiral because as you use more and as you increase your tolerance, so do you decrease the effects the substance has. So at some point when it comes to addiction, you're no longer using for those recreational purposes or even mood altering purposes to improve mood. At some point in addiction, we're just using to not feel bad because with so much repeated use, we sometimes feel withdrawal symptoms or we feel the decrease of the effects. So we use more to try to get back to a point where we're feeling before, but it's not going to quite get there, because our tolerance has increased, because our use has been extended over a period of time. So we're no longer using for fun. And sometimes in addiction, we're using for survival, to just not feel bad, to just avoid the crash. And for 1 in 10 people, the abuse, this pattern of use, leads to addiction. This is a process health condition. It happens one thing at a time, and 23.5 million Americans are addicted to either a substance or alcohol. And all started with that one use, and it went from use to abuse to addiction. The risk of addiction can be looked at in a couple ways. Sometimes we have a genetic disposition for addiction, or if there are environmental factors that can come into play. So for the genetic predisposition, there can be certain brain characteristics that can make someone more vulnerable to addiction. There could be psychological factors as well, whether it's personality traits or a history of mental health concerns. With environmental influences, perhaps it's more about exposure or history of abuse or trauma, or seeing substance being used in your family at early ages or different places in your life. Access to the substances can play an important role too. And we all have this exposure. And in pop culture, I mentioned before, like if you're in the area, there's a liquor store on every corner, but not just that. It's in our media, it's on TV, it's on our phones. The advertisements are always there. It's in movies, in different kind of ways. So looking at alcohol, nicotine, and other drugs at early ages is likely and sometimes happens, again, because of the exposure. And 9 out of 10 people with substance use problems started using by the age of 18 because it was available and because it was visible. And thinking about substances and how people perhaps sometimes go from one substance to another. People who are addicted to each of these substances are more likely to be addicted to heroin. So for alcohol, people who are 2 times more likely, marijuana 3 times more likely, cocaine 15 times more likely, and opioid painkillers 40 times more likely, because opioid painkillers sometimes are those things we get prescribed from the doctor, and sometimes they do get quite expensive, or the doctor just says, you're done, you need to come off of it. But when we do, unfortunately, opioid painkillers are there to cap our opioid receptors. So that's how they sort of disguise the pain from us. And when that cap comes off, or when we stop taking the medication, that pain comes back. And sometimes it is very difficult to deal with. And we will try to find other ways to manage that pain. And sometimes heroin is that next thing that happens. One, for financial reasons, it is a little bit cheaper, but also two, it's also more accessible, especially if you're not able to get the prescription. So something to be mindful of how these addictions occur. Sometimes it's financially, sometimes it's a physical need, a pain that we're not at the time addressing any other way. So specific drugs of abuse that we've mentioned already before, but just to list out here: alcohol, marijuana, inhalants, cocaine, stimulants, depressants, hallucinogens, narcotics, and designer drugs. And we'll get into each of them here as well. So depressants, first thing, which includes alcohol, benzos, diazepines, barbiturates, and quaaludes, things like that. They slow down or depress your central nervous system. So they give you that feeling of tiredness and unresponsiveness, and sort of this lackadaisical, relaxed state. And sometimes we also have the idea that more is better. A lot of times when we talk about alcohol and working in colleges and higher education before, there's a lot of discussion around harm reduction. And a part of harm reduction is also being able to understand what moderation and less is more actually is. So even if you are a person that is of drinking age and you want to partake in drinking, keeping in mind what is the best amount for you and having a cap on that. 2 drinks maximum when you go out with friends, or being able to balance out food and drinking, so the impact on your body and your tolerance won't severely change behavior or thought pattern or decision making. and making sure you understand your body and its needs. So with alcohol and other prescriptions, whether you prescribe benzos or barbiturates for any reason, keeping track of how it impacts your body and what you can do to make sure you keep yourself safe. So other side of the spectrum are our stimulants. These increase heart rate, increase your blood pressure, increase temperature, give you that energy and physical activity. They stimulate the nervous system. So again, opposed to the depressants where it sort of calms you down, this cranks you back up. So some of these things look like cocaine or crack cocaine, weight loss pills, amphetamines, methamphetamines, nicotine, and caffeine. So yes, caffeine is a stimulant too. And if we take enough of it, that can be an issue too. And we can have an addiction to caffeine as well as a substance that we put in our bodies. So a lot of times people have a misconception that, well, if a substance is making me do better, if I'm more active, it must be good for me, right? If this must be good if I'm able to then do more on it. And not necessarily, because what you're putting in your body isn't natural. Therefore, if and when it ever tries to come out of your body, or it's not present anymore, your body will have still a reaction that perhaps still could set you back and make you less productive, less focused than what you were before. So definitely some things to keep in mind. Although stimulants may seem like they're helpful in the moment, if they are not prescribed or used responsibly, like any other prescription or a substance, then it could still pose a problem to our day-to-day life and interactions. So next, of course, we have marijuana, cannabis, and we had a bit of a comment about that. Of course, being mindful of even if it is, we think it's CBD, what could still be in there, because THC could still possibly be an answer. But the effects that we are seeing with cannabis or marijuana is euphoria. Unfortunately, impaired memory and concentration and knowledge retention are also impacted. Loss of coordination, loss of motivation, animated behavior, and other similar conditions that impair work and personal relationships. Sometimes psychosis, again, depending on those THC levels, that is a possibility too. Other things considering how soon or how early we're using these substances, it can impact our brain functioning and brain activity too, especially if we're using them consistently before the age of 25. Next thing we look at is opiates and opioids. So these slow down your breathing and your brain activity. They also depress the central nervous system. It's used for pain or extreme conditions, so surgery, dental procedures, perhaps even cancer treatment to ease the pain of a lot of folks. We'll see in this category things like heroin, codeine, methadone, and most pain meds, Loratab, Percodan, Vicodin, things of that nature. Again, a lot of times these things are prescribed and they are meant to be monitored with your doctor and monitored use. So if ever that does not happen, or things go unprescribed, or perhaps you go cold turkey off your medication, you seek out other substances, it can become detrimental and they can be very addictive to the body. Lastly, we have hallucinogens. So these are those designer drugs that were listed before, completely synthetic material, and it distorts often your senses. So your five senses that are at work, you see, smell, or hear different colors, and that can happen too. And with LSD, PCP, EMDMA, and mushrooms. Taking a pause here to take note that yes, there are psychedelic therapeutic treatments available now, things like psilocybin that are hallucinogens. But again, under heavy monitoring by a provider are these things under treatment for things like PTSD and anxiety of that nature. So yes, those things are out there, just to give notice to it, but just again, they are with heavy monitoring and treatment from a provider. So these things perhaps could have some type of role in treatment and in healing, but by themselves, unmonitored and unchecked, can be dangerous too. Signs and symptoms of substance abuse generally affect three areas. So your emotional, behavioral, and physical self. And just to look at some specifics of each, we could be looking at weight loss, sweating, chills. Sometimes we even smell alcohol in some folks. Emotionally, we're looking at perhaps aggression, burnout, anxiety of some kind, depression, paranoia, or denial. And as far as behaviors, we notice several behavioral changes as well, different reaction times, impaired coordination of some sort, slurred speech or behavior, irritability, excessive talking, inability to sit still, limited attention span, and poor motivation or lack of energy. And it may be a range of things that we will notice, that different people in our lives will notice. Our coworkers will notice something different. Perhaps our managers will notice something different. Maybe our family members would notice something different about us. The effects of abuse are not just internal, they are very much external, and people around us can witness those changes and see things happening. What we also want to be mindful of when it comes to family and coworker impact is, if we see these changes happening, we want to be very careful not to be enabling the changes. So when I say enabling, it's action that someone takes to protect the person with the problem from the consequences of his or her actions. So unfortunately, enabling actually helps the person to not deal with the problem. So when we enable somebody, we enable them to continue their current pattern of behavior, and we don't give them the opportunity or the accountability to change. So examples of this are covering up, rationalizing, withdrawing, avoiding, blaming, controlling, or even threatening behavior too. So keeping in mind, if we have someone like this in our lives and we know they're struggling with something, are our behaviors enabling this? Are our behaviors encouraging what they're doing? Or do they hold them accountable? Do they call them out? And do they suggest help and offer resources when needed? So asking yourself those questions. Examples of family traps, or traps family members and coworkers fall into when it comes to enabling: sometimes sympathy, giving a lot of excuses, um, feeling the need to be apologetic to that person or creating diversions for that person. This impacts our innocence and how we're feeling about the relationship or about how their situation is going. It could increase anger, pity, or tears can come from that person too. And it's just keeping in mind that they may say things to us, or they may try to avoid the situations. But in those moments, those comments don't change history or things that have happened. They don't automatically, magically correct the behavior. Treating anyone dealing with substance use, abuse, or addiction is a very involved and a very delicate process that involves everyone, really. So not just the person, but the family too. And everyone is benefited when they are able to seek treatment and being held accountable for their roles in that environment. So how do we know when we need help? How do we know when we get to that point? Well, going back to those warning signs, if we know those warning signs are growing and growing or becoming more prevalent in the person's lives, of course, if there's difficulty performing work, sometimes caused by addiction or other problems, perhaps the supervisor may suspect things are going on and decide whether or not that is the case, or unless it impacts the workplace. So if you see those changes in, again, thoughts, emotions, or behaviors, then that is something to approach that person, just check on them, see how they're doing, or see if their job performance is impacted by those changes, to see if something needs to be done. If that is the case, again, counseling services are available. So a therapist can help employees decide what to do if you have alcohol or issues with other substances. We can also help an employee decide what to do if someone is your family. So if you're an advocate or an ally or family member to someone, we can also process, well, if it's not you, what can we do or help someone else that you do know? And again, conversations with a therapist are confidential, so you can have these open discussions just to investigate, what are my options? What can I do to seek treatment? And a lot of times, just to wrap up, treatment options can be varied. Of course, the first, early intervention services, which could look like simply education, learning about the options out there, learning about substances, addiction, and use in general. It could be outpatient services, whether it's those individual sessions we talked about before, and so maybe some substance education groups. It could be IOP, or partial hospitalization services, where you go and have individual and group sessions with other people for a couple times a week during the day. Whether it is residential outpatient services, where you go and stay somewhere, And finally, whether it is medically managed intensive inpatient services, so where we get medication to help us manage being in recovery and manage our continued either abstinence from use or our stepping down from use. And there are many different programs that include medication management that could be an option to that as well. That does wrap up our information from today, going over workplace policies, how this impacts our work environment, our family, our coworkers, and the various substances that could be involved when it comes to substance use, abuse, and addiction. If you have any additional questions, please reach out to us at concern@bmhcc.org for questions about our services or additional information about substances or substance use at workplace. If you have any concerns for yourself, or perhaps now you're interested in getting involved with Concern EAP, we would be happy to hear from you. No issue too big or too small. No issue is too big or too small to come have a conversation. It's always confidential, always free. All you have to do is reach out to 901-458-4000, or if you're just interested in more information, simply just go to our website at myconcerneap.com, and we have lots of things available there for you to access and see. So we do hope to hear or see you soon. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns. And until then, thank you for listening.